Before London's Underground Postal Railway carried its first letter, its tunnels were already protecting something the post office had never expected to handle. In the darkness beneath the capital, important works from British museums and galleries were placed beyond the reach of the danger gathering above. There were no mail trains running past them. The railway was unfinished. So how did a project designed to move post become a wartime refuge for national art? Today, the system is usually remembered by its later name, Mail Rail, the narrow, electric railway that once ran beneath central London. Its miniature trains, underground platforms, and hidden passages seem purpose-built for mystery. Yet the most surprising part of its story happened before those trains existed. In 1917, the tunnels of what was then the Post Office London Railway had been driven beneath the city, but the equipment needed to operate the line had not been installed. The First World War had changed the government's priorities. A railway intended to solve delays on London's crowded streets had become a completed shell. Miles of deep, enclosed space with no postal traffic moving through it. At the same time, institutions above ground faced a problem that had barely existed when the railway was first proposed. London could now be attacked from the air. Valuable collections kept in prominent public buildings were no longer protected simply by heavy walls and locked doors. Moving selected objects underground offered a different kind of security. The decision brought two histories together. One was the history of the General Post Office, attempting to create a faster mechanical route across London. The other was the effort, by museums and galleries, to protect objects held for the public during wartime. Their meeting point was not a grand vault or a secret treasury. It was an unfinished transport tunnel. To understand why that tunnel existed at all, we first have to return to the traffic above it. At the beginning of the 20th century, the General Post Office depended on speed. Letters arriving at London railway termini had to reach sorting offices, move between districts, and leave again, according to demanding schedules. A delay in the centre could spread outward through the wider postal network. But central London was becoming a difficult place through which to move anything reliably. Horse-drawn vehicles shared the streets with motor traffic, buses, carts, and pedestrians. Fog and congestion could turn a short surface journey into an uncertain one. The post office could organise staff and sorting work with great precision. Yet the road between two offices remained beyond its control. This was not the first time engineers had considered moving post beneath London. A short pneumatic railway had linked postal premises in the 1860s, using air pressure to propel small vehicles through a tunnel. It demonstrated the appeal of avoiding the streets, but it did not become the permanent citywide solution the post office needed. By the early 1900s, the scale of the problem demanded another investigation. A committee examined whether London mails might be carried by pneumatic tube or by an electric railway. In February 1911, it favoured an electric line. The central idea was practical rather than theatrical. Create a dedicated route that road traffic, weather, and ordinary passenger demands could not interrupt. The proposed railway would run roughly 6.5 miles between the western and eastern sides of the city, linking important postal sites on the way. Its tunnels would lie, on average, about 70 feet beneath the streets. Unlike the London Underground, it was not designed for the public. The trains would carry mail, and the stations would sit beneath working postal buildings. That separation was the system's strength. A bag arriving at a mainline terminus could enter a route controlled by the post office itself. No cab, van, or cart would have to fight across the most congested parts of London. Underground, movements could be timed around the needs of sorting offices rather than the condition of the street. Parliament authorised the project through the Post Office London Railway Act of 1913. The Act's purpose was explicit. It enabled the Postmaster General to construct underground railways and related works for post office use. It did not authorise a bullion route, a government escape system, or a secret military railway. The line was built for post. That distinction matters, because the railway's later wartime use was powerful, precisely because it was unplanned. The post office did not build a hidden art store. It built transport infrastructure, and history interrupted before that infrastructure could begin its intended work. The timing could hardly have been more difficult. Britain entered the First World War in August 1914, and construction of the railway tunnels began in 1915. Labour, materials, and government spending were now shaped by wartime demands, but the work beneath London continued. The route had to pass below a dense city already crowded with foundations, sewers, water pipes, existing railway tunnels, and other services. Engineers worked from shafts sunk at selected points, driving narrow tunnels through the London clay. The dimensions were far smaller than a passenger tube because no standing passengers or full-size railway carriages had to fit inside. This was a railway designed around mail containers and compact electric trains. Above ground, London carried on around the works. Postal buildings remained active. Streets stayed busy. Beneath them, the route gradually joined the West End and East End postal districts through a chain of underground sections. Mount Pleasant, one of the General Post Office's most important sites, would become the largest station and the system's main workshop centre. It is easy to look at the completed tunnels and imagine that the railway was already there. But a tunnel is only the space in which a railway may be built. It still needs track, power, signalling, control equipment, lifts, conveyors, station machinery, and rolling stock. By 1917, the tunnelling work was complete, but the operational system was not. The Treasury would not permit the Post Office to order and install the necessary equipment while the war continued. That decision was understandable. Copper, steel, electrical machinery, labour and money all had competing claims upon them. A faster postal link beneath London was valuable, but it was not more urgent than the immediate requirements of a country at war. The result was a peculiar piece of infrastructure. The most physically difficult part had been achieved. A continuous underground route had been excavated beneath central London. Yet, it could not perform the task for which Parliament had approved it. There were no regular mail movements, no timetable, and no stream of bags passing between underground platforms. For the Post Office, this was delay. For another group of institutions, the same empty space began to look like protection. When the railway had been planned, the central problem was congestion at street level. The First World War introduced a threat from an entirely different direction. German air raids brought modern warfare over British towns and cities. Airships attacked Britain from 1915, and aircraft raids later made the danger faster and more direct. In 1917, formations of Gotha bombers struck London in daylight. The damage and loss of life made clear that distance from the battlefield no longer guaranteed safety. Museums and galleries faced a special responsibility. Their buildings were public landmarks, often large and easily identified. Their collections included works that could not simply be replaced if destroyed. Protecting them was not a matter of preserving luxury for a small group. National collections were held on behalf of the public, and their loss would pass permanently into the country's history. Different institutions adopted different solutions. Some works were moved within buildings, placed in cellars, or protected with sandbags and fire precautions. Some collections used other underground locations. The National Gallery, for example, has documented the use of the disused Aldwych Underground station for part of its collection. That episode should not be confused with storage in the post office tunnels, even though institutions could use more than one protective solution. The post office tunnels offered another form of shelter. They lay deep below the roads, away from windows, roofs, and the exposed rooms of museum buildings. Because the railway had not opened, there was no operational traffic to compete with storage. No electric trains were passing through. The feature that made the project appear incomplete now made it useful. This was the first major reversal in the story. The absence of railway equipment was not merely a failure to finish. It created a protected volume beneath the city at precisely the moment when protected space had become urgently valuable. The public above would have seen road traffic, uniforms, wartime notices, and the ordinary facades of London institutions. They would not have seen the second geography developing below, passenger stations used for shelter or storage, strengthened basements, and an unfinished postal route holding objects that had never been intended to enter it. The railway was still waiting for its trains. Before they arrived, the art came down. The Postal Museum confirms that during the First World War, the tunnels were used to store treasures from the British Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Tate. That verified fact is the heart of this documentary. It is also where accuracy matters most. The surviving public summaries do not provide a complete inventory of every object placed there. They do not identify every worker who handled the transfer, every tunnel section used, or every security arrangement. It would be tempting to fill those gaps with dramatic scenes. A famous masterpiece carried at midnight, a named guard keeping watch, or a train secretly moving priceless cargo. But none of those details should be presented without evidence. What can be said is already remarkable. Staff responsible for national collections accepted an unfinished General Post Office railway as a suitable place of protection. Museum objects left the familiar setting of galleries and entered a narrow industrial environment built for a completely different purpose. The physical requirements would have been practical and exacting. Objects needed to be protected from handling and positioned so that they could remain stable. Access through shafts, passages, and incomplete railway spaces had to be managed carefully. The tunnels offered shelter from attack above, but underground storage also demanded attention to the conditions surrounding the collections. Where the public archive does not specify a method, the documentary should show only what the record supports. Protected works, placed carefully within the tunnel, and institutional staff carrying out a controlled operation. Visually, the contradiction is stronger than any invented gold train. Ornate frames and wrapped museum pieces belonged in rooms designed for display. Here they stood against unfinished tunnel walls, temporary lighting, and engineering surfaces. The objects represented centuries of art and public collecting. The space around them represented a new technological network that had not yet performed a single day of postal service. There is also a human chain, even though most of its members remain unnamed. Curators and custodians had to decide what required protection. Handling staff had to prepare and move selected items. General Post Office engineers controlled access to infrastructure that was still technically a construction project. Security and accountability had to continue, while ordinary institutional life was disrupted by war. None of these people needed to know that their actions would later become part of the railway's public story. Their immediate purpose was narrower: use the safest available space responsibly, and return the collections when conditions allowed. The railway did not become a gallery. The works were not arranged for visitors, and the tunnels were not opened as an exhibition. Storage removed the objects from public view. That temporary disappearance was part of their protection. For a period, people could not see them so that future visitors might. This gives the story its human meaning without requiring a fictional family or an imagined conversation. A postal engineering project became part of the quiet labor of cultural preservation. The value lay not in movement but in restraint, careful handling, controlled access, and the decision to leave irreplaceable things beneath the city until the danger had passed. It also changes how we understand the word treasure. Britain's wartime gold story belongs principally to the Bank of England and the financial authorities. The Post Office Railway's verified treasure was cultural. Its tunnels protected objects because they carried memory, craftsmanship, and public meaning, not because they could be weighed as bullion. If you value these overlooked moments when British infrastructure was asked to do something entirely unexpected, consider subscribing to Royal Mail Memories UK. The purpose here is to follow the evidence into the working places that rarely appeared in the official picture. By the end of the war, the tunnels had proved useful, but they still had not proved themselves as a railway. The armistice in 1918 did not bring the postal railway immediately to life. Britain emerged from the war with pressure on public finances and unusually high costs for the materials the system required. The tunnels existed, but completing the electrical and mechanical railway remained expensive. This created a long interval between excavation and operation. Londoners continued to move above a route that was present beneath them, but absent from daily postal work. The post office still faced the original problem of transferring mail across congested central streets, while the solution remained incomplete underground. The pause is important because it prevents the story from collapsing into a simple sequence of construction followed by opening. The railway had already lived through two identities. First, it was an ambitious transport plan. Then it was a wartime protective space. Only later would it become an operating postal system. Work finally resumed in 1923, The task was no longer mainly to drive tunnels through clay. Engineers now had to convert those tunnels into a coordinated machine. Track, electrical supply, signaling, and controls had to work with stations, lifts, and the postal buildings above. Rolling stock had to be built for the small loading gauge and the specific demands of mail traffic. The protected museum objects were no longer the defining contents of the tunnel. The space was being prepared for containers, bags, and parcels. Temporary stillness gave way to planned motion. That transition also required a different group of workers. Construction crews and engineers prepared the infrastructure, but the completed railway would depend on post office staff at platforms, lifts, conveyors, and control positions. The trains could run without drivers, yet the system was never without people. Automation changed where human work happened. It did not remove it. After years of interruption, the original promise was approaching its test. Could a narrow railway, buried beneath London, finally move the post more reliably than the streets above? On 5 December 1927, the Post Office Railway opened with parcels traffic running between Mount Pleasant and Paddington. More services followed as the system entered regular use. Nearly 14 years had passed since Parliament authorised the railway. The contrast with 1917 was complete. The same underground world that had contained protected artworks now held rails, electrical equipment, signals, platforms, and compact trains built to carry mail. The railway was designed to operate without drivers aboard the vehicles, controlled as part of a larger system from fixed positions. Mail did not simply fall from a sorting office into a train. Staff above and below had to connect several stages. Bags and parcels arrived at postal buildings, were sorted according to destination, transferred vertically between working floors and railway level, and placed into containers or trains for the correct station. At the other end, the process reversed. The underground journey saved time only if every transfer around it remained organized. The engineering exploited gravity as well as electric traction. Station approaches could help trains slow as they rose and accelerate as they descended away, reducing the energy and braking demanded in constant stop-start operation. The small scale of the railway allowed it to pass beneath London, with tunnels far narrower than passenger lines. Yet its real achievement was not novelty alone. It created a dependable postal corridor between key offices and railway termini. Surface congestion might still trouble vans elsewhere in the network, but this part of the journey now had its own controlled route. At its peak, the railway carried about 4 million letters a day and operated for roughly 22 hours. Those figures belong to its later working life, not to the wartime art storage period, but they show what the delayed project eventually became. The empty tunnel of 1917 developed into a continuous industrial operation beneath the city. The workers who made it function rarely appeared to the people whose letters traveled through it. Platform staff handled containers, controllers watched movements, engineers maintained electrical and mechanical equipment, and sorting office workers kept the mail aligned with the railway's destinations. A driverless train could automate one movement, but accuracy still depended upon human decisions before and after it. This is why the art storage chapter should not be treated as a colourful fact added to a general railway history. It reveals something fundamental about infrastructure. A system may be designed for one narrowly defined task, yet the physical space, skills, and institutions around it can acquire another value when circumstances change. The Post Office Railway had been justified by minutes saved in mail transfer. During the war, its value was measured differently: depth, enclosure, and separation from the vulnerable city above. After 1927, the measure changed again to reliability, capacity, and the disciplined rhythm of postal work. One tunnel system, three kinds of value. The final question is what connects them. The Post Office Railway was not built to hide gold, and its trains did not carry Britain's reserves through a secret financial network. The documentary record gives us a better story because it is true. The railway was authorised to solve a practical postal problem. War delayed its completion. That delay left a deep, unfinished route available when museums and galleries needed protected space. Treasures from the British Museum National Portrait Gallery and Tate entered tunnels intended for mail, and the railway served the public before it ever began operating as a railway. What it protected was more than a group of valuable objects. National collections depend upon generations of largely unseen work: cataloguing, handling, conservation, security, and decisions made before danger arrives. In this case, that work met another largely unseen profession: the engineers and workers creating the post office's underground network. The primary payoff is therefore a contradiction. The railway's first important service came from not running. No timetable, motor, or train was required. Its depth and incompleteness were the useful features. Once the emergency passed, the same space could be finished, equipped, and returned to its original purpose. That is why the strongest surviving image is not a gold bar beside a mailbag. It is a protected artwork standing inside an industrial tunnel, where beauty and utility briefly occupied the same hidden space. Mount Pleasant later became the operational heart of this railway, with staff working beneath the sorting office while London slept above them. The next documentary, Inside Mount Pleasant's Hidden Mail Rail Night Shift, follows that transformation from the quiet tunnels that once sheltered art to the people and machinery that eventually kept the post moving through the night. Before the first postal train departed in 1927, the tunnels had already completed one duty no engineer had placed in the original plan. They had kept part of Britain's cultural memory safe long enough to return to the light.